Welcome, Yamhill County, to Speaking Frankly. I'm your host, Howie Harkema, and our tagline is, "And how we doing?" We're doing great today. I have two wonderful guests. They're both from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Mid-Willamette Valley. First, we have Shyle Reuter. Raise your hand, Shyle. Education and Outreach Director, and Mel Keller, Education and Outreach Specialist. Woohoo! Glad to have you with me. And I'm going to jump to speaker mode. And here we go. All right. So, is the Fair Housing Council of Oregon a nonprofit?
Yeah, we are a statewide nonprofit organization. We are funded through government grants, jurisdictional grants. Some of those governmental grants are state, some are federal, some are just local jurisdictions as well.
Sure. And as a nonprofit, you have to have a board of directors. Do you have a board of directors?
We absolutely have a board of directors.
So I'm going to start with you, Shyle. Give us a little bit of background to prepare that prepared you for this important work.
Yeah, so a little bit of my background is I actually started in 2001 as a bilingual medical case manager, English and Spanish, for people living with HIV and AIDS. And it was out of the Marion County Health Department, so near Yamhill County. I had finished my degree at Western Oregon University. And after my time at the health department, decided to just stay in HIV services. And in 2002, started working at an organization and just focused in on housing and housing education for people living with HIV and AIDS. And, you know, in that education piece, one of my favorite things to teach were fair housing laws. And really, one of the things that I learned by teaching fair housing laws to people that are living with disabilities is it is one of the most important pieces of information, legislation, information about people's rights that people really need to know, that they just don't realize that they need to know, because these laws are all about creating access to housing. And so many folks don't even know that these laws exist or that these protections are in place. And so that work that I did with folks living with HIV and AIDS directly linked me then to working for the Fair Housing Council, and then really just focusing in on fair housing.
That's awesome. Mel, what is your background?
So I come from a background in academia. I did my master's at the University of Oregon in political science. And while I was a master's student, I was teaching political science classes, and that really introduced me to a lot of the history of fair housing legislation and other civil rights legislation. And it's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to work for the Fair Housing Council, because I'm able to put into practice all of the theory that I've been teaching about and researching for many years.
And it's prepped you for this incredible job.
It's something, can I say, Howie, about Mel? I'm going to brag about you for a little bit, Mel. Mel also has a focus area on around veterans issues as well, which we know so many veterans are people that are living with disabilities like mental health issues, substance abuse disorders, and Mel has a specialty area right in there to more deeply connect with those communities.
Boy, that's super important in this day and age. So what is fair housing, period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fair housing, the definition that we use are civil rights laws that protect people from discrimination in housing. So the fair part refers to people who have protected class status, and the protected classes are determined by both national and state laws. And then the housing part refers to specific dwellings, so places that are considered housing. It covers everything from the application to the tenancy to the move-out process as well.
So why is this important? Why is fair housing important to Oregon?
Yeah, I would say fair housing is important, I would say federally, and then also to Oregon, because what we know We have a hotline where people can call, they can contact us, report if they believe they've experienced housing discrimination. And what we know is housing discrimination is alive and well, specifically for certain groups of people, certain identities. We call those groups protected classes. So for folks who don't know, that would be on a federal level: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, families with children, and also disabilities. And then on a state level, we're looking at marital status, source of income, sexual orientation, gender identity, and then certain jurisdictions add in more protections. What we know specifically about the state of Oregon, the contacts that we get, 50% of the contacts that we get are related to disability. We can even further look at the intersection between who living with disabilities are calling us. That's people of, different races, different national origins. Maybe it's elderly people that are wanting to age in place. Maybe it's somebody that has an emotional support animal. So it might be more emotionally based or mental health based that they need that animal. So we're seeing that housing discrimination, it's unfortunately, it's alive and well. I would say that as an organization, we would love to get to the point where we close our doors because there is no more housing discrimination, but that is not likely to happen. We have these laws in place, but the reality is we have these laws because it's still continuing to happen. And so we do a lot of work to get out into the community, to do education about what the laws are, because we're trying to ensure equal access to housing opportunity, equal access to housing choice. The only way that we know that happens is through getting this information out.
So let's talk about rent control real quick. As you know, right now, landlords are able to raise the rent. I think it's once every 6 months. Is that correct? Or more every year?
Howie, that actually falls under a different set of laws than fair housing. That falls under landlord tenant. So it's not our specialty area. I believe it's once a year, though.
Okay, good. So what is the significance of April and Fair Housing Month? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Fair Housing Month is April of every year, and it commemorates the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was passed on, I believe it was April 11th, 1968, and it was actually passed 4 days after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the protests that came up after his assassination were a big part in the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It was one of the most difficult pieces of civil rights legislation to pass, and due to the kind of wellspring of activism after Martin Luther King's assassination, the Fair Housing Act was passed on April 11th. And this really kickstarted a lot of what we see as kind of cases of housing discrimination coming into the public eye. And so we want to celebrate the passage of that legislation every April.
Heavy thing to talk about. So what are the statewide issues that are most common?
Yeah, so we know that, like I said, 50% of the contacts we get on hotline are related to disability. Also, another issue that we hear about, and we don't necessarily hear about this as much on hotline if we're looking at data over the last several years, but what we know from our community advisory groups is that source of income discrimination is rampant. It is one of the number one reasons people are being denied access into housing. It might be landlords saying, I won't rent to somebody who's got a Section 8 voucher. Or it might be a landlord becoming cold or aloof when somebody mentions that they have a Section 8 voucher. It might be a landlord not sharing how many units are available when somebody says that they have a Section 8 voucher, or not offering the same types of move-in specials for that person. We're also hearing about landlords offering higher rent amounts for people with those Section 8 vouchers, specifically higher to where the voucher might not be able to be placed. even though we know that the unit is advertised at a lower amount. So we're hearing about these types of discrimination, also people moving in with those vouchers and then getting a higher number of inspections than other people, getting written up for more things, then also being evicted as a result of that. So we have these community advisory groups in 5 different rural regions of the state. And so we are hearing about this really regularly from those groups sharing with us. And I don't know, Mel, if you want to expand more on that also, since you helped to facilitate a community advisory group.
Yeah, I would say that kind of in line with other statewide trends, what I'm hearing the most from my community advisory group and what my colleagues are in rural areas around the state really has a lot to do with folks who are living with disabilities. And so figuring out the processes by which people living with disabilities can get support and can request reasonable accommodations and modifications in their housing. Oftentimes, it's really a barrier of information. The landlords aren't necessarily out to, harm others or create barriers, but the process can have a requirement of knowledge. And so a lot of our work is specifically around teaching folks and educating folks on their rights, on the processes they have to follow, and how other community groups or their support networks can support folks living with disabilities.
So Mel, what in Yamhill County do you see being common to Yamhill County as itself?
Yeah, I'd say Yamhill County has, the problems that rural communities across the state are facing, particularly a lack of affordable housing. And because of that, there are additional barriers that folks might come up against when they're applying to housing as it relates to fair housing. And so something like Shyle was talking about with Section 8 vouchers, or housing choice vouchers as they're also known, is that folks who have those vouchers might not feel welcome in applying for apartments. If a landlord, once they learn that somebody has a Section 8 voucher, they suddenly become aloof, they don't answer phone calls, they change all of their behavior just because of one specific detail about a person's life. That's discrimination. And it's the same level of discrimination as, saying that you won't rent to somebody with a Section 8 voucher is like saying that you won't rent to somebody who has kids. It's the same level of discrimination under the law. And so a lot of what I do in my work in Yamhill County is educating folks that they don't have to listen to that. It's actually, they should report it if they are being turned away for housing for a variety of issues, but particularly source of income, because we hear a lot from community members who say, I had a landlord who, there wasn't a place on the application for me to list my Section 8 voucher. And because of that, they wouldn't accept my application because I didn't have a source of income, or I didn't have income listed. And so things like that are really what I think is most important about connecting with rural communities and folks in Yamhill County, not just in McMinnville, but across the county, is figuring out how these issues of discrimination are happening in practice, because it's very rarely extremely explicit discrimination, and oftentimes it can feel more subversive or underhanded.
So within Yamhill County, that's great. What fair housing issues are most important in rural communities beyond Yamhill County?
Yeah, I would say beyond Yamhill County, a lot of what we are hearing about, again, disability. So when we talk disability, oftentimes we're looking at a population that is aging and wants to actually age in place. And so as a result of that, people are needing modifications or accommodations so they're still having equal access to their housing enjoyment. We're also seeing, issues around veterans. That becomes a real issue when we're looking at disability. Veteran status is not specifically protected in the state of Oregon. It's protected in the state of Washington, but it's not protected in the state of Oregon. But we still know that if we're looking at veterans, there's a disproportionate number of people that are living with disabilities. And that might be histories of substance abuse disorders, mental health issues, physical disabilities, all of those things, which can impede access to housing or housing stability. And so we're seeing those issues coming up statewide as well, in addition to, the Section 8 vouchers source of income.
Yeah, I'd also say on that note, another thing that we're seeing across the state are issues in counties that are known for being vacation hubs. Oftentimes, housing in vacation counties, they're known as recreational counties, and I believe we have 7 here in Oregon. Housing is increasingly difficult to find in those counties because so many folks are renting out their units as vacation rentals,
Sure.
places like Airbnbs, other sorts of companies like that. And it means that folks who live and work in those communities are getting pushed out just because of vacationers and folks who are coming for a brief stay in their community. And so we're also keeping an eye on that and how communities that focus a lot on tourism can also support the folks who live there.
So how is fair housing connected to the broader housing crisis?
It's a really great question. Oftentimes we have people that think that fair housing might cover, folks who are living outdoors or camping outdoors or living in their cars. And unfortunately, housing doesn't cover folks who are living outdoors. But when we look at who is actually living outdoors, we're seeing disproportionate numbers of people who are representative of very specific protected classes. So we start to look at that, and then we start to look at the reason, like, why are folks living outdoors? Were they evicted for discriminatory reasons? Many times, yes. We're also looking at why aren't people able to access housing? And also sometimes those reasons might be for discrimination. So where we start to see fair housing intersect with issues around houselessness is, eviction, exiting housing, or access to housing. Those are 2 really important, areas where both of those things start to intersect. We also look at fair housing from an issue around city planning. Many cities and jurisdictions actually don't realize they have a legal responsibility to design communities to be inclusive, to promote fair housing, to promote an inclusive community. And so some of the work that we do is also with jurisdictional bodies to educate them around their legal requirements as it comes to fair housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, creating these inclusive communities, because we know if we're going to try to undo all of these issues that are happening with the housing crisis in Oregon, there are so many issues wrapped up in this huge, just tangled mess. We see not enough housing. We see not enough affordable housing. We see not enough inclusive housing as well. So fair housing intersects at so many different levels of the housing crisis that we see. Mel, also, I'd be interested in hearing sort of your perspective on that question as well.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about what you mentioned earlier relating to folks who are aging and interested in aging in place. We know that the population is aging, and we're going to have a larger number of seniors and folks who are older in our communities in the future. And housing is not keeping up with that. In particular, when we look at accessible housing units, places for folks who have mobility issues or other sorts of physical needs in their unit or house, there's just not enough housing for them. And so when you look at folks who might be unhoused or living in shelters or other temporary places who need assistance and need some form of modification to their unit for their equal access and enjoyment is how we phrase it. We know that those units aren't getting built. And so even if cities are putting money into building more affordable housing, it not only needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible. And so that's something we're really keeping an eye on.
Well, Shyle, you were just talking about the houseless, and I want to let you know that we in Yamhill County, since Encompass Yamhill Valley started coordinating the warming and cooling shelters. Just in 2022, 2023, we've already sheltered over 3,700 people.
Wow, that's amazing.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
So how can communities or neighborhoods best advocate for fair housing?
Such a good question. There's so many ways. I think first and foremost, it's really important for people to become educated about what fair housing actually is. That's one part of it. And then how is housing discrimination showing up in their own community? So I think that's the first step. And then the next step is, it can be a person sharing about what they're learning, talking about it. One of the things that we're seeing is that we have been doing a lot of work around talking about fair housing issues within the state of Oregon. And so part of what we're seeing in a lot of the legislation that has come up is fair housing being woven into that legislation. And part of that is really, the education outreach team, us doing work around let's keep talking about these issues because it does really start to make an impact. There's also other ways to get involved. It can be people going to city council meetings. It can be people volunteering with groups that do housing justice work. A lot of different ways. I would also say another way people can get involved, like part of that education or community involvement. We have a lot of Fair Housing Month events that are going on. So people can go to our website, fhco.org, go to the events tab. And in the month of April, we have events, virtual and in person, happening where people can come out. They can show their support of fair housing. We would love to have people join us also for our virtual luncheon that's happening on Thursday, April 27th from noon to 12:30. Our website has more information about that, fhco.org. We would love to see people showing up, supporting in those ways, and then also continuing to show up and support in their community or starting to show up and support in their community.
Well, there's one in Salem coming up, right? On April 14th as well.
Yes, there is. And that event in Salem on April 14th, it's going to be at Broadway Commons at noon. And we're really going to be focusing on some of that jurisdictional work that Shyle was mentioning as it relates to affirmatively furthering fair housing. So how cities, counties, and other jurisdictions have to work and respond to issues of housing discrimination as they happen in zoning, in city codes, in other sorts of jurisdictional requirements. So if you're interested in that sort of work, feel free to check out our website, fhco.org, and there's more information there.
So let's talk about protection for a minute. What does fair housing protect and who?
Yeah, so the protected classes that we talk about when we mention fair housing, the original 4 that were part of the the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were race, color, national origin, and religion. Later in the 1970s, sex was added as a protected class, and then in the 1980s, familial status and disability were added as federal protected classes. And what we know is that here in Oregon, prior to, say, familial status being added, families with children were disproportionately impacted by rental markets. So oftentimes landlords would say no kids, no pets. And in Oregon, over 70% of the rental market was inaccessible to families with children prior to the passage of or adding familial status to the Fair Housing Act. And then in the state of Oregon, we have additional protections. Shyle mentioned marital status, source of income, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so these are just some of the protected classes that exist across the state, as well as others with local jurisdictions.
So what does your agency do and who do you serve? And also, how do you serve them? In what capacity and advocation?
Ooh, Howie, this is such a good question. I've got a lot to share on this, and I get very excited about it. Okay, so who we serve, the short answer is everybody that touches the housing process. And we can do that through several different ways. So we have 2 different branches of our organization. And one is the educational branch, where we're literally reaching out to housing consumers, advocates, providers, jurisdictional bodies, and we're educating them as well. We also have a housing provider hotline where housing providers can email us when they want more information about fair housing and what the laws state. I should say, we're not able to give legal advice. So when housing providers call us with like a very specific situation, we cannot give legal advice on that.
Right.
But that's a really important function that we have, that education function, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We believe that. But we also know that education doesn't always work. So we also have an enforcement team. where if people believe that they have been discriminated against in housing, they can contact our hotline. They can do that through the website, fhco.org, or they can email us information@fhco.org, and basically email us about the situation that has happened that they believe might be discriminatory. The hotline staff usually takes a few business days to get back to somebody about an inquiry. And then they're really asking a lot of questions about what happened, what occurred. Did it happen in a dwelling that is defined as a dwelling under the Fair Housing Act? And really trying to suss out, is this discrimination? Does it meet the legal definition? In those cases where it does meet the legal definition, we can do several different things. We might be able to advocate for a person. So just do informal advocacy where we are, educating the housing provider about what the laws state. We also can help in those cases where the inquiries are bona fide claims. We can sometimes also help file claims with HUD or BOLI. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, hears about federally protected issues around housing discrimination. BOLI, the Bureau of Labor and Industry, hears about state protected class discrimination. Now, who we serve, again, everybody. People don't need to qualify based on income. We don't have income qualifications. We speak English and Spanish on our hotline. If people have language needs outside of that, we also use the language bank to be able to interact with folks. So we're really trying to figure out, how do we increase access to some of these reporting mechanisms? So that's what we do. That's our services. We're really trying to improve access to housing by educating everybody. And when that's not working, by helping to enforce or connect people to enforcement mechanisms of these laws.
So do you see a lot of inquiries coming into your, not only your hotline, but maybe by email, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, we do. We get over 2,000 contacts a year. The majority of those we do end up solving through advocacy. And if something comes up that maybe the folks who man our hotline, if they think this might not be a fair housing issue, it might fall under landlord-tenant law instead, then we'll help direct folks to other resources, places like Legal Aid Society of Oregon or the Community Alliance of Tenants in Salem, or other statewide organizations that can help folks specifically with landlord-tenant law issues. So we're not only able to help people with fair housing complaints, but also to direct them to other resources for other problems they might be having.
So important, so important. What types of housing discrimination are you seeing in Yamhill County, Mel?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of issues surrounding folks who have disabilities, but not specifically issues as they relate to kind of directly being told, you can't live here, or we won't accept you to live here, things like that. Instead, what we're seeing, I'll give an example. If somebody has a history of a disability, so say they got into a car accident 10 years ago, and because they were in a cast, they were unable to work and they lost their job, and then that impacted their credit score. If they're then applying for an apartment now and the apartment company has a specific credit score that they require for applicants, you can actually submit a letter of reasonable accommodation request to show that this credit score was due to a disability and therefore needs to be overlooked. And so it's things like that that folks don't realize are connected to issues of disability that can actually be very helpful for people who are trying to get into housing, who just thought, that they had to, put up with whatever they were getting from applications or from management companies. And our goal in education, particularly around the nitty-gritty details of fair housing law, is to remind folks that there are options and there are forms of advocacy that they can use to better their situation.
So this is going to be my very last question. So how can community members help to end illegal housing discrimination?
Ooh, I love this. It sort of goes back to that adage, if you see something, say something. I mean, it really is. If you see something, say something. And it's really important, I think, to try to get outside of like our comfort bubbles of where we might say something.
Right.
So if we're really looking at trying to make an impact, it's not always going to help if we're staying really insulated with a lot of like-minded people. It might help more if we're going to people who maybe hold some power in that situation. So for example, city councils, right? In those situations where there's power differentials and that doesn't work and it's an individual act of discrimination, it might be contacting the Fair Housing Council hotline. Also, a lot of people don't realize, but it's not just the person experiencing the discrimination that can contact us. If it's an advocate that works with them,
Sure.
that hears the report of discrimination, the advocate can also contact us
Or
on
even
behalf of the person.
right? Even the caregiver could do that.
Even the caregiver could do it. You know, prior to working at the Fair Housing Council, when I was at Cascade AIDS Project, I had people that were coming through my class, my tenant education class, that would talk to me about discrimination that they were actively experiencing. So myself, as somebody who's in the role of an advocate, actually did the initial contact with the Fair Housing Council, because one of the things that I found is a lot of times when people are actively looking for housing and they're experiencing discrimination, their need for housing is really what's first and foremost. So they're not going to slow down and advocate for their rights because, you know, housing vacancy rates are low. They need to get into safe, stable housing. So they're just going to kind of keep going. And so one of the things I was able to do as an advocate was to reach out to the Fair Housing Council, talk to them about what was happening, have one of the hotline staff actually say, yeah, this sounds like it might be discrimination. Could you put me in contact with that person you're working with? And just doing that sort of warm handoff where I could go back to the person that was in my class and say, hey, I talked to the Fair Housing Council about your scenario. They said it sounds like discrimination, or it might be. Would you be willing to talk to them? That was enough for some people to actually stand up for themselves. And I saw different results happening from that. I saw, you know, one person experiencing hate and harassment in housing, being let out of his lease agreement without a break lease fee, also being awarded a settlement as a result of that, keeping his housing voucher also. I saw another person being able to get into housing when a housing provider was trying to screen them out for discriminatory reasons based on disability. And that was literally because someone as an advocate stepped in, right? So I think that there's ways that we can do sort of these small acts of helping to speak up, and then sort of larger acts, speaking to, you know, city council members, state legislators, you know, even calling or emailing the governor's office to say, this is where we're at. Here's the issues that are important. All of those things are really important.
Well, small acts multiply and move up the food chain. And by doing that, it allows more and more people to input into the system. So thank you both so much. This has just been an incredible conversation. And thank you both for all of the hard work that you put in and the incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Howie. This has been great talking to you.
Yeah, Howie, we love getting to be here and chat with you.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. And hopefully it alerted a lot of people and brought some awareness. And would you, one of the two of you, talk about your website one more time and how to get in touch with you?
Yes, so our website is fhco.org. If you go to our website, there's a big red button on the top that says Report Housing Discrimination. If you're experiencing discrimination, feel free to click that button. You can also reach out to us at information@fhco.org. If you have any general questions, are interested in learning more, or being a part of any of these conversations, we'd love to hear from you.
Stick around. I'm going to shut off the recording now.